The origin of modern Special Operations Forces came on the battlefields of World War II. The British Special Air Service is the most famous of these units and saw its direct genesis in that conflict. However, the United States and Canada also fielded a famous unit of special operators in the war, one which the current special operators of both nations consider the ancestor of their respective units. This unit's official name was the 1st Special Service Force, but it was to receive a much more well-known nickname from its enemies, the Devil's Brigade. The Devil's Brigade became so esteemed that it got its own movie of the same name, which premiered in 1968. Although the movie was well received, veterans considered it historically inaccurate. In this video, we will look at the history and exploits of the real Devil's Brigade, why its Nazi enemy feared it so much, and how it has influenced today's Special Operations Forces. The Devil's Brigade got its start in a way that was as unconventional as its operations. In April 1942, United States Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall visited London and met Lord Louis Mountbatten, leader of the British Combined Operations Command. Among Mountbatten's entourage was a man he considered a very odd-looking individual, who talks well and may have an important contribution to make. This man was Geoffrey N. Pike, an unconventional man who was part journalist, part philosopher, and part inventor who advised Mountbatten on strategy. Earlier in the year, Pike imagined an operation called Project Plough, where commando units on motorized sleds would penetrate deep into Nazi-occupied Norway and attack important hydroelectric infrastructure there. Pike also envisioned cross-mountain raids from Italy to Germany and even sabotage operations in Romania and Russia. None of these plans would come to fruition, but Marshall was impressed enough that he agreed with the idea of creating a unit that would go ahead with it. Since Britain couldn't supply troops for this unit, the United States would take the lead in doing so. But at Winston Churchill's insistence, Canadian soldiers would also be selected to participate. The name conferred to this joint unit was 1st Special Service Force. The name had been chosen to conceal its true nature from the Nazis, as the United States Army's entertainment branch was called the Special Services. 35-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Robert Tryon Frederick, a West Point graduate then working in an office position for the War Department, was chosen to lead the unit by then Major General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who led the War Department's planning division at the time. Eisenhower chose Frederick because he was the one most familiar with the plans. Ironically, Frederick believed the plan was unworkable, but because of the high interest in the idea from Washington and London, he was told to go ahead and given a free hand in recruitment and the acquisition of supplies. The Devil's Brigade was organized into 3 regiments, each with 2 battalions. 172 officers were spread throughout its ranks. In total, about 2,300 men comprised the unit. Roughly 2/3 of them were Americans and 1/3 was made up of Canadians. A red spearhead with the letters USA on the top and Canada beneath it in vertical letters was chosen as the unit's insignia. Because one of the unit's primary tasks would be winter fighting, Frederick and his officers had a preference for men with extensive outdoor experience, such as lumberjacks, hunters, rangers, prospectors, and game wardens. Recruitment letters called for single men between the ages of 21 and 35. The core American volunteers for the unit came from Forts Belvoir and Benning. Canadian personnel tended to be selected from units such as the Royal Winnipeg Rifles and the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders. The 1st Special Service Force became official on July 9, 1942, and began training at Fort William Henry Harrison near Helena, Montana, which was seen as an ideal proving ground for men who were expected to operate in mountainous winter conditions. The location was also thought to better preserve the unit's secrecy. Canadian veterans mentioned that Hitler would never think to look for such a unit in a quiet mining town in the American West. It took a little learning to properly integrate the men from the 2 different countries. Marching commands needed to be homogenized between the 2. Uniforms were made identical. Hand-to-hand combat training was taught by Dermot Pat O'Neill, an ex-Shanghai International Police officer who was a renowned expert at it. The men took up standard weapons training, but it quickly became clear they needed to experiment to find the right weapons for their expected mission. For example, they quickly discovered that the 20-pound Browning automatic rifle, BAR, light machine gun, was too heavy and unwieldy to carry in mountainous combat, along with regular gear. Nearby, a group of Marine raiders were training with the lighter M1941 Johnson light machine gun, which used the same .30-06 cartridge as the BAR. The Johnson wasn't so great for the Marines' purposes, so the 1st Special Servicemen traded some surplus plastic explosives they had received for their demolition training for the Johnson. The Johnson weighed about half as much as the BAR and was found much more satisfactory. The men also trained on enemy weapons. They were not only taught how to shoot them, but to take them apart and put them back together. The first Special Service men even got their own unique fighting knife, which Frederick helped to design himself. This was the V42, which derived from the Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife. O'Neill also took the lead in teaching the men how to use these knives. There were also courses on demolition, airborne operations, and endurance. Endurance training came in the form of a 60-mile running circuit. Ski instructors from Norway were brought in to teach the men how they might be tasked to fight in their country's winter conditions. In 2 weeks, the men had gotten themselves accustomed to this type of warfare and were tested in cross-country ski formations, which they needed to maintain with all of their equipment from dusk to dawn. Things were going well for the unit, but then the Allied leaders cancelled Project Plough, imperiling its existence. However, it quickly became apparent that disbanding such an elite unit would do little good, so the Allied leaders decided to keep it. For a time, the Devil's Brigade honed its skills further. After a farewell parade for the people of Helena, whom they had gotten close to, the brigade moved to Norfolk, Virginia, to train in amphibious operations in the spring of 1943. That summer, the unit would finally receive its first mission. Earlier in the war, the Japanese had invaded the westernmost of Alaska's Aleutian Islands. In July, Frederick was told to get his men ready to participate in an operation to dislodge them. That May, a force of 12,000 men launched an amphibious operation against the 2,500 Japanese defenders on the island of Attu. Although outnumbered, the Japanese fought bitterly, with only 29 survivors. The Devil's Brigade would participate in combat against these men's comrades on Kiska. The men's excitement would evaporate, however. The Devil's Brigade saw its first operation on August 15th, but the Japanese had abandoned Kiska by then. Again, it seemed that the Devil's Brigade would miss its chance to participate in combat. In reality, the men who were chomping at the bit to prove themselves under fire would only need to wait a few more months. The first Special Service Force was selected to participate in operations in Italy, where the Allies were slogging northward in a bitter struggle against the Nazis under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. On November 19th, the Devil's Brigade entered the line at Naples. It got its first priority mission on December 3rd, when it was tasked with storming a well-defended German position on Monte La Defensa. American and British troops had tried to dislodge the defenders on this 3,120-foot edifice with over 200,000 artillery shells, to no avail. At 1:30 in the morning, the Devil's Brigade began its climb in foggy and snowy conditions while carrying 60-pound rucksacks, along with its standard equipment. Hours later, some troops from the brigade were nearing the objective but were ordered to hold fire until 6 that morning. Unfortunately, a rock slide spoiled the element of surprise and a firefight developed. Frederick was in the thick of this battle, armed with just a pistol and a grenade. When more troops from the Devil's Brigade arrived at the battle site, the tide began to turn. One of the German units surrendered, but before the prisoners could be secured, one shot a captain in the brigade in the head, killing him. The brigade's troops retaliated by massacring the prisoners and from then on would not take any unless they had specific instructions to do so. By dawn, the battle had ended, with the Devil's Brigade victorious, and this is the episode that climaxes the story in the 1968 movie. The victory did not mean the brigade was safe from harm, however. They had to hold on to the position against intense shelling and probing attacks from the Germans, all the while rations and ammunition were running low. Despite this, the brigade continued to its next objective, Monte La Rementana. After some probing operations of their own, designed to take out enemy sharpshooters, the Devil's Brigade set out through fog and rain to their next objective, and took it in furious fighting by December 9th. In total, there were 532 casualties. Capturing these positions was critical for the continued advance northward toward Rome. When Churchill heard of the brigade's exploits, he said, "If we had a dozen men like him, Frederick, we would have smashed Hitler in 1942. He's the greatest fighting general of all time." The brigade's next operation would come between late December 1943 and early January 1944, when they would be assigned to storm enemy-held high ground that was impeding the northward movement of Allied forces. On Christmas Day, they captured the 4,000-foot-high Monte Sammucro in snowy conditions and in gale-force winds. Monte Vicentaro fell on January 8th, followed by the Monte Maggio range further north, a critical point on the road to Cassino. In the latter operation, the brigade moved so stealthily under the cover of darkness that 100 German prisoners were taken with all of their mortars and machine guns. The cost of these operations was high, though. Of the 1,800 Devil's Brigade members that participated, 1,400 of them were dead or needed to be hospitalized. Frederick himself was wounded 3 times and was promoted to brigadier general not long after these actions. The brigade would go to rest for the next few weeks, but soon would be called into action again in a legendary operation, the defense of Anzio. As the Allies got bogged down in the assault toward Cassino, commanders devised an amphibious operation at Anzio, which was 70 miles behind the German main line and only 30 miles south of Rome. However, the attack stalled, giving the Germans time to dig in. On February 2nd, the Devil's Brigade was again deployed, but casualties had taken their toll and only about 1,000 men were fit for action. Despite this, the elite unit guarded the Mussolini Canal on the right flank of the Allied beachhead and was responsible for holding 13 kilometers of front for 99 days. Such was the confidence in the brigade at this point that it was given 2 times the frontage to hold as the 3rd US Infantry Division. Although these operations were supposed to be defensive, the Devil's Brigade balked at such passivity. After all, they had been trained as an offensive assault unit and so looked to take the fight to the enemy in whatever way they could. They launched silent raids at night on enemy positions, often only using daggers as their weapons. The brigade even looted the German food supplies so their enemy would be deprived. Often after these operations, the brigade left their red spear insignia behind with the phrase, "The worst is yet to come," written in German. One dead German officer at Anzio had noted in his diary, "The Black Devils are all around us every time we come into the line, and we never hear them." This phrase gave the 1st Special Service Force its much more famous name. The brigade's reputation was so fearsome in the German ranks that the Nazi brass in the area offered a 10-day furlough to the first soldier or unit to capture one of these black-hearted men. Gradually, the Devil's Brigade replenished its depleted roster through new volunteers. When the action at Anzio ended, the brigade led the attack on Rome, which ended in victory with the city's capture by Allied forces on June 4th. The brigade had been tasked with taking 6 bridges over the Tiber. Moving through Rome under sniper fire, the brigade gradually cleared the centers of German resistance and captured the bridges, preventing their demolition and paving the way for the Allied forces to enter the city. Frederick was wounded an additional 3 times in the arms and legs during these operations. Before the end of June, Frederick got a promotion to command the 1st Airborne Task Force. His men were distraught at his departure. Frederick would go on to be wounded 3 more times before the war ended. No other American general was shot at more in the entire history of the United States Armed Forces. He was awarded 8 Purple Hearts, 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, 2 Distinguished Service Medals, a Silver Star, 2 Legions of Merit, and the British Distinguished Service Order by the time his service was done. The brigade would continue its operations despite Frederick's departure. After getting about 2 months of well-deserved rest, it would be tasked with taking part in Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of southern France. Its new commander would be Colonel Edwin Walker, and it would again play a leading role. The Devil's Brigade left Corsica on the night of August 14th. The objective was to take control of the islands of Île du Levant and Port-Cross, which were located about 5 miles off Toulon. Securing these was vital to protecting the left flank of the Allied invasion force. Among the most important tasks was for the brigade to neutralize a German artillery battery on Île du Levant which could fire upon the Allied ships. The operation began at about 1:30 a.m. As the brigade had done on many other occasions, they camouflaged their faces to better blend in with the surroundings. In transit, the men used inflatable rafts to move silently toward the shore. Things proceeded smoothly on Île du Levant up to the position of what looked to be the German guns. But they were fakes made of drain pipes, and the men having now revealed themselves, the Germans opened fire on the Devil's Brigade with machine guns and mortars which came from a fortified cave on the other end of the island. When they got fire support from HMS Lookout, the shells unfortunately failed to destroy the Germans in the cave, so the soldiers in the brigade made their way through the hail of enemy fire and positioned themselves on 3 sides of the cave before firing inside. The Germans eventually surrendered themselves and with them control of the island. On Port-Cross, the Devil's Brigade encountered 5 forts with Germans entrenched inside. Although these forts dated to the Napoleonic era, they had walls which were thick enough to withstand shelling from the USS Augusta's 8-inch guns. Even bombs from RAF fighters flying overhead did not dislodge the Germans. It would take the Devil's Brigade 2 full days to deal with these fortifications. The brigade fought their way inside one of them, and the 15-inch guns of the HMS Ramillies dealt with the others. The brigade's actions in France continued in September. They moved through the French Riviera and continued to prove their effectiveness. However, the Devil's Brigade's time as a cohesive unit was dwindling. As 1944 started to wind down, it was stationed near the village of Villeneuve-Loubet, near the Italian border, which it had liberated from the Nazis at the end of August. On December 5th, the unit was disbanded after a final parade, much to the tears of the men in it. The Canadians returned to their own colours after being honoured with a pass-in review, eyes right officer's salute. Meanwhile, the Americans were reorganised into the 474th Infantry Regiment, which was outfitted with an anti-tank company, heavy machine gun crews and mortars, the equipment that Frederick had long desired. Why did the Devil's Brigade meet a premature ending despite its success? In the first place, the unit's special status and international personnel produced some administrative hardships that were never fully resolved. Frederick himself commented in a letter dated the 19th of February 1944 that it would be better for the unit to pass out of existence while it's still in its prime rather than to sustain it through a period when it will be remembered only for its faults and defects. Another reason was that the brigade had an extremely high attrition rate, at 600%. Because it suffered such heavy casualties in its operations, the Devil's Brigade needed many replacements. Inevitably, these were not trained to the same elite standard as the founding members, rendering the brigade more ineffective in carrying out the special operations that had been assigned to it. All told, the Devil's Brigade was believed responsible for inflicting about 12,000 casualties on the Nazi war machine and capturing 7,000 prisoners through the course of its career. The unit as a whole was awarded the French Croix de Guerre with a silver gilt star and the Presidential Unit Citation, America's highest collective commendation. In 2006, Canadian members of the unit were awarded the U.S. Army's Combat Infantryman Badge, and in 2013, the brigade was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the two highest civilian awards the United States government can confer. The unit's legacy goes beyond commendations. Modern American and Canadian Special Operations units consider themselves to be descended from the Devil's Brigade. The United States Army Special Operations Command, for example, has an insignia that bears an almost identical resemblance to the 1st Special Service Force, with a red spearhead containing a Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife. This command contains all of the Army's Special Forces groups, more popularly known as the Green Berets, which were established in 1952. Because its members are often selected from the Green Berets, the U.S. Army's 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, the Delta Force, also traces its roots to the Devil's Brigade. In Canada, the Canadian Special Operations Command and Canadian Special Operations Regiment trace their origin to the 1st Special Service Force. The latter was formed in 2006. Because of the influence of the Devil's Brigade, all of its members who spent at least 180 days in the unit were accorded the right to wear the U.S. Army's Special Forces tab, according to Army Regulation 600-822, issued on June 24, 2013. World War II created the modern world in many ways, and the rise of dedicated special operations forces is yet another of its legacies. While there have always been special operations in the world's militaries, World War II created dedicated, professional units to practice the craft. The Devil's Brigade's effectiveness left a permanent impression on both the United States and Canadian armed forces, and they have never forgotten its lessons. What do you think about the Devil's Brigade? What other notable instances do you think deserve special mention? Make sure to let us know in the comments. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more military analysis from military experts.